Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, our keynote speaker, will be well known to many of you. A renowned thought leader and academic, Mr. Bilahari brings a high-level understanding of the strategic challenges facing our region, combined with the ability to engage thoughtfully and critically to challenge and improve our understanding of how we can better face these challenges together. A former permanent secretary of Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, his many achievements include serving as ambassador to the United Nations and to Russia. Mr. Kausikan has continued to serve as an academic and is currently chairman of the Middle East Institute of the University of Singapore. The Indo-Pacific is an environment of strategic competition with technological and military drivers further accelerating change. To help us explore the importance of resilience and innovation for small to medium powers in our contested regional environment, it is my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker and great friend of Australia, Mr. Bilahari Kausikan.
Thank you. Air Marshal Hartfield, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me back to speak to you for the second time. It seemed rather incautious of you to do so, but thank you. My theme is China's strategic dilemmas, and I'll get straight to it. The war in Ukraine has lasted a month. It began on the 22nd of February. Today is the 22nd of March. And it's clear Mr. Putin miscalculated very badly, and it's clear Mr. Xi Jinping followed him into a strategic dead end with no easy exit. Now, we'll never know exactly what Mr. Putin told Mr. Xi when they met before the opening of the Beijing Winter Olympics on 4th February and declared that their partnership had no limits. That Putin waited until the Olympics ended before invading Ukraine argues for a degree of foreknowledge on China's part. But Beijing nevertheless seems taken aback by the scale of Russia's attack, by the resoluteness of the Ukrainian resistance, and by the tough and united Western response to the invasion. Mr. Putin may well have misled Mr. Xi on all counts because he misled himself. The key strategic issue for Beijing is its competition with the US. The war in Ukraine has sharpened the line between them. Now, I think Beijing wanted to stabilize relations with Europe as far as possible in order to focus on dealing with the US. But China's refusal to criticize Russian aggression complicates its relations with Europe and will continue to do so as long as Russia does not withdraw from Ukraine. China is putting on a brave face, but is in a serious dilemma. It is confronted with three mutually irreconcilable objectives. First, China does not want to become collateral damage from sanctions directed at Russia. The Ukraine war has disrupted an already fragile global economy. China's growth was already slowing for a variety of reasons, and Beijing is grappling with complex internal economic issues. With the 20th Party Congress in the autumn, maintaining stability is China's watchword, and obviously Ukraine is the antithesis of stability. Secondly, China has always been neuralgic about preserving respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference as key norms of international relations. And the reasons for this can be summarized in three words: Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was a direct challenge to these norms. Thirdly, and most crucially, China wants to preserve its partnership with Russia. The Sino-Russian relationship was never as idyllic as Moscow and Beijing like to portray. But whatever difficulties China may face because of the invasion of Ukraine, China will not break with Russia for a very simple reason. China has no other partner anywhere in the world with Russia's strategic weight who shares China's distrust of the current global order. Which other country is prepared to go as far as Putin's Russia to work with China to create a less Western-oriented multipolar order, and reclaiming what China believes is its rightful place in such a world lies at the heart of Xi Jinping's China dream. Now, Beijing has indicated that it is prepared to play a role in brokering a ceasefire or settlement in Ukraine. And of course, a quick negotiated end to the fighting would be in China's interest. But are Beijing's calls for negotiation significant, really significant, except as a sign of China trying to adjust its position and limit the damage? Will China really use whatever leverage it may have impartially? Talks between Russia and Ukraine are difficult enough without another interlocutor who is not neutral. Having failed to secure a swift victory, Putin must now secure a decisive victory. Putin's right to rule rests on the claim that he had restored Russia's strength and the world's respect for Russia's strength. But the perception of Russian strength and respect for its strength are among the casualties of Putin's war in Ukraine. Now that he has been denied a quick victory and questions have been raised about the competence of Russia's military, Putin cannot afford to look weak or accept any compromise that leaves him vulnerable to looking weak. And only Mr. Putin knows what not looking weak means in practice. Now, I am among those who think that the West mishandled relations with post-Soviet Russia during the 1990s. But that is now all moot. It is irrelevant. Not only does it not justify aggression, but that may no longer be the relevant issue. The botched Russian invasion has changed the stakes. And I suspect what is now a hazard for Putin is his legitimacy. You all know that President Zelensky has made clear that Ukraine would not seek NATO membership and is reportedly discussing neutralization. But the ferocity of the Russian offensive continues unabated. What outcome in Ukraine would be acceptable to Putin and the West and Ukraine? What does China mean when it says that Russia's legitimate security interests must be considered? And how far would China be prepared to push Putin to accept a compromise? I don't know. And at present, I don't think anyone, China included, has clear answers to these questions either. And only events will bring clarity. But I very much doubt, that Beijing will be prepared to go so far as to fundamentally jeopardize its relations with Russia or to do anything that would undermine Putin's grip on power. Still, that said, despite their shared distrust of the current global order, China is far more integrated into it than Russia and has benefited more from it than Russia. The China dream is certainly revanchist and assertively so. But to call China revisionist is, to my mind, something of an overstatement. China has no strong incentive to kick over the table and seek radical revisions, at least not to the economic aspects of the existing order. Beijing may want to dominate the global system, but not to overthrow it. Under its dual circulation approach announced in 2020, China aims to become more self-reliant in key technologies and depend more on domestic household consumption to drive growth. Sanctions against Russia will lead Beijing to try and accelerate its drive for self-reliance and internally driven growth. But all this is far easier said than done and will not show significant results for a long time, if ever. As the name suggests, dual circulation has two aspects, and the other is still reliance on overseas markets. China is Russia's most important economic partner. But the Russian economy is only about the size of the South Korean economy. The United States, Japan, the EU markets are far more important to China than Russia and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Being subject to sanctions of an unprecedented scope and with about half its reserves frozen, China has nowhere to go except China. Russia will almost certainly become even more dependent on China, but will this be a liability or an asset for Beijing? The US and Europe are not going to cut China any slack in implementing sanctions against Russia. And China will certainly protect its own interests, as for example, in its decision to deny Russian airlines spare parts. And I doubt China is eager to throw good money after bad to support the ruble. Nevertheless, with the majority of China's 1 billion internet users still cheering Russia on in Ukraine, and despite the risk of non-compliance with Western sanctions, I also doubt that Beijing can entirely refuse to help Russia, because to turn its back on Russia risks raising inconvenient questions among its own people about the party's wisdom in placing no limits on China's relationship with Russia. And such questions have already been asked by a few Chinese intellectuals, a few brave Chinese intellectuals. They certainly do not represent mainstream views and will be ruthlessly suppressed. But the implications for the party and for Mr. Xi personally, should such views seep into the wider public, will be a serious concern. To prevent this, the Chinese leadership must maintain some semblance of solidarity with Moscow, and for that semblance to be credible, it has to be tangible. On Russia, political and strategic considerations pull Beijing in different directions from economic considerations. And in a party congress here, we should not assume economic considerations will prevail. There is no easy way for China to reconcile its objectives. Beijing will have to walk a fine and precarious line, and that line has got even finer and more precarious now that the US has revealed that Russia asked China for military and economic assistance and warned that agreeing will have serious consequences for US-China relations. So it's in a fix. But I think it's important to understand that China's Ukraine dilemmas come on the back of other foreign policy errors. The most prominent mistake was the premature abandonment of Deng Xiaoping's sage approach of hiding strength and biding time. China has become more assertive, if not downright aggressive, in pushing its strategic interests in the East and South China Seas and in the Himalayas, and more mercantilist in its economic engagements with foreign countries. After the global financial crisis of 2008, Chinese leaders seem to have swallowed too much of their own propaganda about China's system being superior and that the West in general and the US in particular was being in absolute and terminal decline. China's history and political culture have instilled in Chinese leaders the conviction that strong central authority is essential to good government. And this perhaps leads them to underestimate the resolve and resilience of decentralized Western systems. Their underestimation of the West was no doubt reinforced by the chaotic Trump presidency and the bumbling initial Western response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But strength and ambitions, once revealed, cannot be easily concealed again. And Chinese trade and Chinese investments and glib talk about a community of common destiny cannot erase anxieties about China. Nobody will ever shun China. It's an economic and geopolitical fact that cannot be ignored. But I am hard-pressed to think of any country, including some who are very dependent on China, that are without concerns about one aspect or another of Chinese behavior. Now, the concerns are not all the same for every country and are not held with the same intensity by every country, but they exist and are reshaping the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific. To some, I think a very large extent, the Quad and AUKUS were as much the result of China's mistakes as successes for American or Western diplomacy. And concern with Chinese behavior is driving some European countries to try and play some sort of security role in the Indo-Pacific. Russian aggression and Chinese reluctance to criticize Russian aggression has also catalyzed some broader geopolitical trends that were largely tentative and inchoate before the invasion. It has revitalized the idea of the West, which after the Cold War was loosening and in some danger of entirely decomposing. Moreover, the idea of the West that is reconstituting itself is a robust idea. Mr. Putin has succeeded where successive post-Cold War American presidents have failed. He has got Europe to take its own defense seriously. Overnight, Germany doubled its defense budget and weaned itself from the taboo on arms transfers. And even the determinedly neutral Swiss joined sanctions. Now, of course, there are still unanswered questions about Europe's newfound resolve, long-term energy security among them. But they are unlikely to defect Europe's new trajectory. Without external intervention, the sheer mass of Russia will probably eventually overwhelm Ukraine and force a surrender. But that will not be the end of the story. Whatever is imposed on Kiev, the bitterness of a grinding and bloody war will prevent Moscow from taking Ukraine's stability for granted. And so long as Russian forces remain directly or indirectly in occupation of all or part of Ukraine, Europe and the transatlantic alliance will continue to cohere. And equally importantly, Russian aggression and China's support for it has dispelled a dangerous Western illusion about the nature of post-Cold War international relations. Now, one of the most foolish statements I have ever heard from a Western leader was then Secretary of State John Kerry criticizing Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea as 19th century behavior in the 21st century. There are many, many, many good reasons to criticize Russia's annexation of Crimea. But this particular criticism assumes, probably unconsciously, that your rival ought to share your values, and if they did not share your values, this was somehow unnatural. But why should they share your values? If they shared your values, they would not be your rival in the first place. Fortunately, I have not heard any Western leader make such silly comments this time. And this is an important shift of intellectual framework, because a similar cast of mind has bedeviled American and European relations with China for as long as I can remember, perhaps. From 1972 to the end of the Cold War, US-China relations were primarily based on clinical geopolitical calculations. And this was healthy, because US-China cooperation, when it occurred, was without illusions. But after the end of the Cold War, and in particular after China joined the WTO in 2001, the comforting but naive assumption that economic reform would inevitably lead to political reform increasingly began to contaminate Western approaches to China. Now, I don't think anyone was quite so deluded as to think that the Chinese system would become exactly like the West. But the expectation certainly was that it would evolve in the same broad direction. And the disillusionment after it became clear that this was not going to happen played no small role in shifting US-China relations from a mode in which the primary theme was engagement to one where the primary theme is now rivalry and competition, and likely to remain so. Assuming your rival shares your values or ought to share them can only lead to unpleasant surprises. More generally, it would be prudent not to overemphasize values in international relations. Framing strategic competition as between democracy and authoritarianism limits rather than expands support. Not everyone regards every aspect of Western-type democracy as universally attractive, nor is every aspect of Chinese authoritarianism universally abhorrent. Values are important, don't misunderstand me, but interests are even more important, and interests are certainly more stable. China's misjudgments began towards the end of Hu Jintao's second term. Xi Jinping has doubled down on them. That these errors spanned administrations of two very different leaders suggests that their root causes are systemic and not due to the folly or mistakes of any individual. And it's not going to be easy for any Chinese leader, however powerful, to change course. China is a communist country, not any longer in its ideology, but certainly in its political structure. China is a Leninist state led by a Leninist-type vanguard party that legitimates its right to rule not by class struggle, but by an ethno-nationalist historical narrative of humiliation, rejuvenation, and the attainment of the China dream. Now, positioning the China dream as the rectification of China's humiliation at Western hands since the late 19th century infuses the China dream with strong elements of revanchism and entitlement. A prominent Chinese academic has even described China's rise as, and I quote, granted by nature. Granted by nature. Think about that. Think about what it means. A Leninist vanguard party insists on control over every aspect of state and society. The party's interests must always take priority over all other interests. And this attitude is, I think, the root cause of the Chinese behaviors that many countries find concerning. Its effects are accentuated by the revanchism and sense of entitlement of the party's legitimating narrative, as well as the traditional Chinese assumption of superiority that equates community or order with hierarchy with China at the apex, of course. So little wonder that China's dreams are often nightmares to other countries. An authoritarian state does have some advantages. We have to admit so. It is better placed to set goals and pursue them relentlessly over the long term. A Deng Xiaoping capable of taking a cold, hard look at his life's work, deciding that it was at risk of failing and radically changing direction with minimal opposition, could not have succeeded in any Western democratic system. But, and this is a very big but, but the ability to set and relentlessly pursue long-term goals is an advantage only if the goals are correct in the first place. Deng Xiaoping's decision to reform and open up was correct. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution were enormous disasters, costing millions of lives. Indeed, it was the immensity of Mao's mistakes that enabled Deng to so radically change course. Deng Xiaoping introduced the principle of collective leadership to ensure that the excesses of Maoist China would not be repeated. But by discarding term limits and concentrating power around himself, Xi Jinping has reintroduced something akin to a new Maoist single point of failure into the Chinese system. There is good reason to wonder about the quality of information being fed upwards to decision makers in China. China has insisted that the situations of Taiwan and Ukraine are not the same, and indeed they are different. Taiwan is a more important node in the global economy and more strategically important to the US and its allies in East Asia. I hope that the Chinese leadership carefully ponders why Putin so badly misjudged how easily Ukraine could be conquered and misjudged the international response to his attempt to do so. Now, China's strategic dilemmas are real. Still, we should not assume that they will necessarily make China change course. China has no good options. But precisely because it has no good options, Beijing might well conclude that American and more generally Western hostility is so implacable that it is a sunk cost and that no basic adjustment of policy is necessary because it will not make any difference to how the West regards China. International opprobrium of China's support for Russia's aggression is in any case, at best, a secondary consideration. The primary consideration for Chinese leaders will be internal. Can the party admit to having made such a great mistake? The coalescing of the West does not imply that a China that continues to tie itself to Russia can be isolated or contained, as the Soviet Union was contained. It has become common to describe US-China relations as a new Cold War. This is an intellectually lazy trope that fundamentally misrepresents the nature of the competition. The US and the Soviet Union led two different systems which were connected only at their margins. US-Soviet competition was over which system would prevail. But the US and China are both vital components of one global system. Russia, too, is part of the same system, but a relatively minor part, except perhaps for energy. The US and China and all other components of the global system are connected by a web of supply chains of a scope, of a density, and of a complexity never before seen in history. These supply chains are what distinguish 21st century interdependence from earlier periods of interdependence, and disentangling them is no easy matter. Thus, as it is easier for China to talk about becoming more self-reliant than to do it, it is easier for the West to talk about diversifying supply chains to become less dependent on China than to do it. The global web of supply chains is unlikely to bifurcate across all sectors, although partial bifurcation has already occurred in some sectors, and more bifurcation is likely in sectors that have national security implications. But complete across-the-board separation into two systems is highly improbable. So the US and China will continue to compete within this single system, and competition within a single system is fundamentally different from competition between systems. Competition within a single system is about occupying a position that will enable you to benefit from interdependence while mitigating your own vulnerabilities and exploiting your rivals' vulnerabilities. It is about using interdependence as a tool of competition. Competition within a system is not and cannot be about one system displacing another system. It cannot even be about any vital part of the system disrupting any other vital part of the system in any way that could fundamentally damage the entire system. In this kind of complex, non-binary competition, it is as impossible to contain China as to contain yourself. Now, none of this means that the geopolitical and intellectual shifts catalyzed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine can be disregarded by China. Broad global geopolitical trends are moving in directions that Beijing will not find comforting. Ukraine has understood the importance of regional balances and the vital role of US leadership in such regional balances. Even if not every country was prepared to say so explicitly or publicly, anxieties about China had always made Asia more aware of this strategic reality than other regions. This strategic reality is now clear in Europe and will eventually dawn on countries in the Middle East as well. No country may be without some reservations about the United States, but nobody has any real strategic alternative, because without the United States as a backstop, there is no regional balance to China or Russia, or for that matter, Iran. At the same time, the nature of US leadership is in the midst of a long-term redefinition. Russia is a dangerous adversary. China is a formidable competitor, but neither poses an existential threat to the US in the way that the Soviet Union posed an existential threat. Competition within a single system cannot be existential because it takes place within a common framework. It is not about changing the framework. And whatever we may think about their systems, it would be absurd to harbor the same kinds of hopes or fears about the Chinese system or the Russian system as those who once hoped or feared that communism could replace capitalism. Without an existential threat, there is no reason why Americans should any longer bear any burden or pay any price to uphold international order. And this is the thread that links the Clinton administration through the Obama and Trump administrations to the Biden administration, with the George W. Bush administration as an exception forced by 9/11, the chief priorities of all the other administrations were domestic. And this is not the retreat from the world or neo-isolationism that some have portrayed, but a recalibration of the terms of America's engagement with the world. More than 50 years ago, as part of the process of disentangling itself from the intervention in Vietnam, the 1969 Guam Doctrine heralded the US moving from direct intervention in Asia to being the offshore balancer. The US has been remarkably consistent in the offshore balancer role ever since. And I believe a similar shift in American strategic posture is underway in the Middle East as a response to mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan, And sooner or later, this change of posture will take place in Europe too, delayed but not diverted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. An offshore balancer is not in retreat, but demands more of its allies, partners, and friends in terms of sharing the burdens of upholding order. The Biden administration has engaged and consulted allies, partners, and friends much more than its predecessor, and this is all to the good. But remember this, the United States does not consult you only merely because of your good looks or for the pleasure of your company, but to ascertain what you are prepared to do with it to meet strategic and regional challenges. It's a more polite form of Trump's transactionalism. As AUKUS has demonstrated, Biden is prepared to go to unprecedented lengths to provide tools to allies who are prepared to step up. The last time the US shared nuclear submarine propulsion technology with an ally was more than 60 years ago. In Southeast Asia, ASEAN has not sufficiently internalized these new realities, and the hard fact that while the US under Biden will still be polite to those not prepared to step up, it will not take them seriously either. That Thailand, a former US ally, was bypassed twice in 2021 by Secretary of Defense Austin and Vice President Harris ought to have been a salutary lesson for all ASEAN members. Now, ASEAN need not, indeed it should not, do everything the US wants it to do any more than it should do everything China wants it to do. But unless ASEAN finds the strategic imagination and political will to define the parameters of what it is prepared to do and equally important, what it is not prepared to do with both the US and China, ASEAN will be marginalized. Just insisting on your centrality does not make you central, nor are you really central just because others politely call you central. My final point is that Ukraine has also drawn attention to the nuclear dimension of regional balances. Just before his country was tragically invaded, President Zelensky, speaking at the Munich Security Forum, rather wistfully mused about his country's giving up the nuclear arsenal it inherited from the Soviet Union in return for a piece of paper. And he was not wrong. It's too late for the Ukraine, but I think others would have noted the lesson. In any case, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan has suggested that the US deploy tactical nuclear weapons on Japanese soil, as it does in some NATO countries. And in fact, for several decades, Japan has been quietly preparing, with American acquiescence, if not complicity, preparing for contingencies that may require to acquire an independent nuclear deterrent of its own. And in South Korea, opinion polls show overwhelming support for the deployment of American tactical nuclear weapons on Korean territory. And Koreans have been debating the desirability of openly debating the desirability of their acquiring an independent nuclear deterrent for some time. Now, the proximate cause of this is, of course, the North Korean acquisition of nuclear devices, if not yet weapons, and ICBMs, and China's modernization of its nuclear forces. As North Korea and China improve their second strike capabilities, the questions are bound to arise about the credibility of American extended deterrence, as they did in Europe decades ago, once the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons. I think it is almost inevitable that Japan and South Korea will come to the same conclusions as Britain and France did decades ago, if they already haven't come to those conclusions. Now, I don't think either Japan or South Korea are eager to become nuclear weapon states. It will be immensely politically painful and internally divisive. But what are the alternatives? I think the inherent logic of the circumstances these countries find themselves in will, however reluctantly, push them in that direction. Because the alternative would be the breakup of the American alliance system and subordination to China. And for both Japan and South Korea, that would require such a fundamental redefinition of their national identity that the nuclear option will be the less traumatic option. I don't know how long it will take, but sooner or later, a multilateral balance of mutually assured destruction will arise in Northeast Asia between US, Japan, Russia, the two Koreas, and who have I left out? And China, sorry, how can I forget that? All right. The process of getting from where we are now to where I think we will land up will be extremely fraught and even dangerous. But the final result, if it is as I have described, will be, I think, stabilizing. If you throw in India and Pakistan into the equation, this multilateral nuclear balance will essentially freeze the existing configuration of power, multilateral configuration of power in the Indo-Pacific. And this will provide maneuver space for small countries like ASEAN and my own. Now, this kind of multilateral balance is not the kind of multi-balance that China or Russia seeks, because nuclear weapons are a great equalizer. And insofar as the China dream is a dream of hierarchy, with China at its apex, that dream will have to be substantially tempered, de facto, if not de jure, to this new reality. And that makes, I think, in the long run, for healthier relationships between China and all its neighbors. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me.